Okay, good morning again. Let's continue our discussion with nationalism and the growth of democracy, with looking at the French in the latter part of the 19th century. If you remember from our previous slide talking about France, we said that the Second French Republic basically failed when Napoleon became declared himself emperor and declared France to be an empire. So on the surface, Napoleon III was a constitutional monarch, but in reality, he was a dictator, but he was a dictator that was very popular, largely because he eased off on a lot of the things that he put into place that were restrictive to start with. And France was going through a period of prosperity. And usually in politics, whenever people have jobs and things are going well, they're probably going to be popular while they're in office. As far as foreign affairs are concerned, France in this time period had a mixed bag of successes. They were successful with building the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, which enabled them to secure that area militarily. It became later, over the course of history, a much contested, location, because controlling access between those two seas starts to become very, very important in the 20th century. They did try to take over Mexico in the 1860s. The Cinco de Mayo is actually a part of recognition of this time period when the Mexicans defeated a French force at Puebla. The reason why they were able to get away with this is the United States was involved in a civil war at the time. And ultimately, they were just unsuccessful. The guy they put into place to be Emperor of Mexico was executed. And by the late 1860s, Mexico had regained its independence. With Italy, by helping the Italians, by helping Cavour, they actually created a rival. And so that wasn't a good situation for the French. And of course, the big upset in this time period for Napoleon III was the Franco-Prussian War, which, if you remember from an earlier slide, was picked by Bismarck. France lost territory. They had to pay Germany for this conflict, and this was just too much. And so Napoleon winds up resigning, and they create the Third French Republic. Now, the problem with this republic is that there was a tremendous amount of disagreement over how far this republic should go. If you remember from the earlier slide, liberals and more radical people clashed with this. And Paris always has been a hotbed of political turmoil. And so they wanted to, in Paris, make sure that things did not go back towards a more conservative bent. They led an uprising, and it was suppressed by the government. So that was something that never really kind of went away. The people in Paris, the Paris Commune, felt really betrayed. This new republic had a system of government that kind of resembles our own. There were two houses in the National Assembly. There were lots of political parties, however, and one thing that makes it different from ours is that these political parties had to form coalitions. They had to basically get together and agree to cooperate. And then once they did that, they could choose their prime minister or their premier and create cabinets. However, this is a potentially unstable form of government. As you can see from the slide, within a 10-year period of time, there were 50 different coalition governments in France. So that's not always a good system to use either. The big scandal that occurred in this time period was something called the Dreyfus Affair. There was a French officer who was Jewish who was accused of selling secrets to the Germans. There was a lot of secrecy around this. This guy was, to be honest, railroaded. There was a person who was a traitor, but he was being protected by the government because of who he was. And Alfred Dreyfus was basically the scapegoat. So, there was a major travesty of justice. And if it wasn't for this journalist named Emile Zola, he maybe would have spent the rest of his life on Devil's Island in South America. But because of his journalism, he exposed this travesty of justice, and Dreyfus was eventually exonerated and released. But The unfortunate consequence of this scandal is that it did show how much anti-Semitism existed in Europe in the late 19th century. So much of it that people like Theodor Herzl, they decide that maybe living among non-Jews is a good idea for Jews. So they began to push for the creation of a Jewish homeland, which is called Zionism. This is not necessarily Israel at this moment because Israel was under Turkish rule, but the idea that Jews need a homeland somewhere. There were lots of reforms in France in this time period. They are taking power away from the Catholic Church. So education, which normally was a church affair, now becomes a public one. They create a welfare state where they're taking care of people's needs, providing safety nets like old age pensions. They do formally make that separation between church and state. The Catholic Church is no longer being backed by the government. They actually close down some monasteries and such, and they give freedom of worship to everyone. Eventually, women were granted the right to vote in France, but it took a long time because a lot of politicians were afraid that women would vote for conservative or religious candidates. And so they were afraid that to give them the right to vote. But by 1946, right after World War II, they were able to gain the right of suffrage. Okay, and that concludes this slide.